Christmas is supposed to be about family, warmth, and love. But that night, sitting at the table with my son, his wife, and the grandchildren, I heard words I never thought would come from my own child's mouth. "Don't come back," he said, cold as the winter wind outside. Everyone froze, forks midair, eyes wide. My heart cracked, but I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I only smiled faintly, because I knew something he didn't. I wasn't leaving quietly. That evening had started with so much hope. I had carried pies I baked myself, carefully wrapped gifts, and even wore the old red sweater my son had loved as a boy. I wanted the night to feel like the Christmases we used to have, when he was small, when laughter filled the air, and when love seemed unshakable. But time changes things. Families grow, shift, and sometimes drift apart. I knew his wife had never liked me much. She tolerated me, but her smiles never reached her eyes, and her words often carried an edge of impatience. Still, I thought, for the sake of the children, for the memory of what we once had, we could all come together peacefully. At first, everything seemed fine. The kids ran around with excitement, tearing into the presents I had chosen so carefully. Their little faces lit up, and for a while I felt a flicker of warmth in my chest. My son even laughed once or twice, though I noticed how quickly he quieted when his wife glanced his way. Dinner was served, and we sat down. I offered to say grace, but his wife interrupted, her voice sharp. "Let's keep it short. The food's getting cold." I lowered my hands, swallowing the sting, and whispered a prayer silently to myself. It was halfway through the meal when it happened. Out of nowhere, my son set his fork down and looked straight at me. His voice was calm, but his words cut deeper than any scream could have. "Don't come back. This is the last Christmas you'll spend here." The room went silent. My grandchildren froze, their little eyes darting between us. His wife smirked, barely hiding her satisfaction. And me? I felt a weight press down on my chest, but I didn't let it crush me. I sat there nodding slowly, as if his words were simply weather passing through. "All right," I said quietly, taking another sip of water. No trembling voice, no begging, no tears. Because while they thought they were shutting me out, I knew something else. Something they had chosen to forget. That house. The very one I was sitting in, the walls around us, the roof over their heads, the dining room where we ate. It wasn't entirely theirs. Years ago, when my husband passed, I had put my share of the inheritance into that home. A sizable sum. Enough that the deed still carried my name, alongside my son's. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was just an old woman they could dismiss. But the truth was, I had a voice and I had rights. And if they didn't want me there by choice, then they were going to face me by law. I stayed through dessert, smiling gently at the kids, pretending as though nothing had changed. My son's words still echoed in my head, but not with pain, with determination. As I drove home through the falling snow that night, the Christmas lights of the neighborhood blinking softly, I made a promise to myself. I would not let them erase me. If they wanted me gone, they were going to learn exactly what it meant to push me out of a house I had helped build. And I already knew who my first call in the morning would be. The morning after Christmas, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands. The silence in my house felt heavier than usual, like the walls themselves were holding their breath with me. I replayed my son's words over and over in my mind, "Don't come back." Each time the sting lessened, and in its place, a slow, steady fire began to burn. For a moment I considered doing what so many parents do, swallowing the pain, convincing myself that maybe he was right, that maybe I should just fade into the background of his life. But then I remembered the decades I had spent sacrificing for him, the nights I stayed up sewing costumes for school plays, the mornings I worked overtime so he could go on field trips, the inheritance money from his father, my husband, that I had invested into the house he now called his own. I wasn't just some guest at his table. I was part of the foundation that built his life. That thought steadied me. I opened the drawer beside me and pulled out an old file folder. Inside were papers I hadn't looked at in years. The deed to the house, bank statements, legal documents from when his father passed. And there it was, in black and white, my name. Proof that I still had a stake in that home. Proof that I wasn't as disposable as they thought. I picked up the phone and called an old friend, Margaret. She wasn't just a friend, she was also a lawyer. Retired, but sharp as ever. When she answered, her warm voice almost undid me. But I swallowed the lump in my throat and told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment before saying, "They think they can throw you out like yesterday's trash? Not if I have anything to do with it. Come by tomorrow, bring the papers." Now, for the first time since Christmas dinner, I felt like I could breathe. That day, I went about my chores with a strange calm. I baked bread. I watered the plants. I even sat down to read a book I'd been putting off. But beneath it all was a current of determination. Every sweep of the broom, every page I turned was a reminder that I wasn't powerless. I was preparing myself, not for war in the loud, shouting sense, but for justice. The next morning, I drove to Margaret's house, the folder clutched tight in my lap. Snow crunched under my tires, and the winter sky stretched pale and endless above me. She greeted me at the door with a hug, then led me inside to her cluttered office. Lined with books and files from her years of practice, we spread the documents across her desk. She adjusted her glasses, scanned the deed, and then looked at me with a glint in her eye. "You still own a third of that property," she said firmly. "Legally, they can't push you out. And if they try, well, let's just say we'll make things very uncomfortable for them." I laughed softly, the sound surprising even me. Relief washed over me, mixed with a new kind of strength. We talked strategy. It wasn't about taking everything from them. I didn't want to ruin my son's life. I just wanted respect, recognition, and if they couldn't give me that willingly, then the law would ensure it. As I left Margaret's house, the cold air biting at my cheeks, I felt lighter. The pain of my son's rejection was still there, but it no longer defined me. Now it was fuel. That evening, I sat at my own dinner table with a small plate of stew. Alone, yes, but not defeated. I thought about how my son's wife had smirked when he told me not to come back. I thought about how sure they both seemed that I was powerless. And I smiled, because they had no idea what was coming. Revenge, I realized, didn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it was quiet, patient, meticulous, like a seed planted in winter waiting to bloom in spring, and I was ready to plant mine. The first week of January, while the holiday decorations were still hanging in their neighborhood windows, Margaret helped me draft the letter. It wasn't cruel, and it wasn't dramatic. It was precise. A notice that outlined in clear legal language the share of the property I still legally owned and the rights that came with it. I remember watching her type, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. Each click felt like the sound of my voice returning. For years I had been quiet, careful not to upset anyone. But now, through the words of that letter, I was speaking louder than ever. When it was done, Margaret slid it across the desk to me. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. I looked down at the page. It wasn't just paper. It was a mirror of my strength, proof that I wasn't powerless. I nodded. "Yes, I'm ready." A few days later, the letter was delivered. I pictured my son opening it, his brow furrowing as he read the words. I pictured his wife standing behind him, her smirk fading, her face paling. And though I wasn't there to see it, the phone call I got that night told me everything. He called around 8 o'clock. His voice was tight, clipped. "Mom, what is this?" I kept my own voice steady. "It's a reminder," I said calmly. "That house isn't only yours. You told me not to come back, and I respect that. But if you want me gone entirely, you'll have to buy out my share. At fair market value." There was silence on the line, then a muffled whisper. His wife, I imagined, hissing in the background. Finally, he said, "This is ridiculous." "No," I replied, my tone firm but not angry. "What's ridiculous is being erased from a home I helped build. What's ridiculous is being treated like I don't matter. You made your choice at Christmas dinner. Now I'm making mine." He hung up without another word. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. The following days were tense. He didn't call again right away, but I heard from Margaret that his wife had phoned her office, furious, demanding explanations, trying to twist the facts. Margaret, unbothered, had calmly explained the situation. My rights were indisputable. If they wanted me gone, they'd have to pay me what was fair. If not, I still had the right to access the property, to step foot inside whenever I pleased. I could almost hear his wife's shrill frustration echoing down the line when Margaret told me the story. It gave me a quiet satisfaction. About a week later, my son showed up at my house. He didn't knock gently. His fist hit the door like a hammer. When I opened it, his face was flushed, his jaw tight. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded. I took a deep breath and looked him in the eye. "Because you pushed me out and you thought you could erase me. I'm not trying to ruin your life. I'm reminding you that I still have a place in it, whether you like it or not." He stared at me, his chest rising and falling, but behind the anger, I saw something else. Fear. Not of me, but of what this meant for him and his wife, of the money it would take, of the inconvenience of acknowledging the truth. "I don't want to fight with you," I said softly. "But I won't be treated like trash. You owe me respect, and if I can't get it from your heart, then I'll get it through the law." For the first time in years, my son had no quick reply. He turned, stormed down the porch steps, and drove off. When the taillights disappeared into the night, I closed the door and leaned against it. My hands were trembling, but not from fear, from release. For so long, I had carried the weight of being dismissed, ignored, made small. Now I was standing tall again, And whether they gave me respect willingly or grudgingly, one thing was certain: they would never look at me the same way again. The weeks that followed were heavy with silence. My son didn't call, and I didn't reach out. But silence can be louder than shouting, and in that quiet, something was shifting. One Saturday afternoon, I got a call from Margaret. Her voice carried a hint of triumph. "They've contacted me," she said. "Not your son, of course, his wife. She wants to negotiate." I smiled, though the ache in my chest lingered. Negotiation meant they finally realized this wasn't going away. For once, they had to look at me not as a burden, but as a force they couldn't ignore. A week later, I sat in Margaret's office across the table from my son and his wife. The tension was so thick it was almost a fog. His wife avoided looking at me, her chin held high, arms crossed like a child refusing to admit she'd done wrong. My son, though, couldn't hide the weariness in his eyes. Margaret began calmly, laying out the terms: my legal ownership, the valuation of the property, the choices they had: buy me out fairly, or accept that I still had every right to step back into that house. His wife scoffed. "This is absurd. She hasn't lived there in years. She doesn't deserve a penny." I met her glare steadily. "What I deserve," I said softly but firmly, "is respect. And what I own, by law, is undeniable." For a moment, no one spoke. My son rubbed his forehead like the weight of it all was pressing down on him. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "We can't fight this. She's right." His wife whipped her head toward him, eyes blazing. But the truth hung in the room, undeniable. She could mock me all she wanted, but she couldn't erase the ink on those papers. The meeting ended without an agreement, but I had already won something far more important than money: recognition. They knew I wasn't someone they could push aside anymore. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, staring at the snow falling in soft sheets, and for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Not because the battle was over, but because I had found my voice again. A few days later, my son came alone to my house. He looked different this time, not angry, not defiant, just tired. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had cried weeks earlier, and for a while we said nothing. Finally, he spoke. "Mom, I shouldn't have said what I did on Christmas. I was angry, and I let her push me into it, but I didn't mean it. Not really." The words were like balm on an old wound. I studied him, this man who was still my little boy in so many ways. His shoulders slumped, his hands restless on the table. He wasn't just apologizing. He was asking for something deeper, for forgiveness, for a bridge back to me. I let the silence linger before I answered. "You hurt me," I said quietly. "More than you know. But I'm glad you're here now. That counts for something." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "I don't want us to end like this. Tell me what to do." For the first time in weeks, I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "Start by remembering that I am not disposable, that I am part of this family, whether she likes it or not. Respect isn't a gift. It's the bare minimum." He squeezed my hand, a small but genuine gesture. It didn't erase what had happened. It didn't fix the cracks overnight, but it was the first step towards something better. And as I watched the snow continue to fall outside, I realized this was the turning point, not just in our legal battle, but in our relationship. He had seen me stand up for myself, and it forced him to see me differently. Not as the fragile mother who would accept anything, but as a woman who knew her worth. That was a kind of victory no lawyer's letter could ever fully capture. The weeks after that kitchen table conversation were different. Not easy, not simple, but different. My son had cracked open a door I thought he had locked forever, and even though his wife wasn't happy about it, I could feel the shift. At first, it was small things. A phone call every couple of days, a text asking how I was feeling, even a picture of the grandkids playing in the yard. These were gestures I hadn't seen in months, maybe years. He wasn't saying the words out loud, but his actions carried a quiet apology, one that softened the sharp edges of my anger. His wife, on the other hand, was colder than ever. She barely spoke to me when we crossed paths. Her smile stretched thin like plastic. I didn't expect her to change, and I didn't need her to. I hadn't fought this battle for her approval. I fought it for me, for the dignity that should have been mine all along. The legal process wasn't over. Margaret kept me updated, explaining every step, making sure I understood that while reconciliation was possible, my rights were still protected. "You don't have to choose between family and fairness," she reminded me. "You can have both." That gave me comfort, because even though I was healing with my son, I couldn't forget the humiliation of that Christmas dinner. The words, "don't come back," still echoed in my mind some nights, sharp and cutting. Forgiveness was on the horizon, but trust, that would take longer. One Sunday afternoon, my son invited me to dinner. Not Christmas dinner, not a holiday, just a simple meal. I hesitated before saying yes, but something in his voice made me believe he was sincere. When I walked into the house, it felt strange. The decorations from Christmas were gone, but the memory of that night clung to the walls. My son greeted me warmly, but his wife only offered a stiff nod before retreating to the kitchen. Dinner was quiet at first, but then the children started chatting about school, about their friends, about little things that had nothing to do with lawyers or property. Their laughter broke the tension, and for a moment, I felt like I belonged again. After the meal, my son walked me to the door. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. "It means a lot." I nodded, looking him straight in the eye. "Thank you for asking." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few months, we found a fragile rhythm. His wife never warmed to me, and maybe she never would. But my bond with my son and grandchildren grew stronger again. We talked more honestly now, not just about the weather or errands, but about feelings, about mistakes, about respect. The legal matter was eventually settled quietly. He agreed to compensate me for part of the home, enough that I could live comfortably without worry. It wasn't about the money, it never had been, but the recognition of my worth in writing meant more than any check ever could. The day the papers were signed, Margaret hugged me. "You did this," she said with a smile. "Not me, not the law. You stood up for yourself." And that night, as I sat alone in my little house with a cup of tea, I thought about how far I'd come since that Christmas. The humiliation, the anger, the heartbreak, they had all been real. But so was the strength I found. So was the peace I had carved out of the chaos. Sometimes I still replay that Christmas dinner in my head, the clinking of glasses, the forced laughter, the sharpness of my son's words. But now, instead of breaking me, the memory reminds me of something else, that I am not disposable, that no matter how much others may try to silence me, I have the right and the power to be heard. And as winter turned into spring, I realized something important. Revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about building something stronger from the rubble. I didn't just get even. I got free. In the end, my revenge wasn't about tearing my son's life apart. It was about reminding him and myself that I still mattered, that I wasn't someone to be dismissed like an old ornament. After the holidays, the lawyer's letter opened his eyes, but it was my strength that kept them open. We may never go back to what we once had, but we've built something new, a bond built on honesty, not obligation. He knows now that love without respect is hollow, and I know that silence is no longer my answer. That Christmas may have broken me, but what followed rebuilt me stronger. And every time I sip tea by the window, watching the seasons change, I smile not because I won the fight, but because I found my voice.